Winter, 1943. A freezing silence grips the Russian steppe. Thousands of German soldiers, once proud, unstoppable, now crawl through the ruins of Stalingrad. Their faces are pale, their uniforms torn, their eyes empty. Above them, Soviet artillery lights up the sky like Judgment Day. Inside his headquarters in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler receives the message he had feared but refused to believe. The Sixth Army has surrendered. He stares at the telegram, his hands trembling. For the first time, the man who dreamed of ruling the world realizes Germany has already lost. Before we uncover how Hitler's arrogance and denial destroyed his empire from within, make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell icon, because this story isn't just about war. It's about how power, when blinded by pride, always collapses. To understand why Stalingrad broke Germany, we must go back to the summer of 1942. After failing to capture Moscow, Hitler shifted his obsession. His eyes turned south, toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the industrial city on the Volga River, Stalingrad. Taking Stalingrad wasn't just strategic, it was personal. It carried Stalin's name, and Hitler wanted to erase it from the map. He believed the city's fall would crush Soviet morale and secure Germany's access to vital oil. But his generals warned him, "The Volga is too far. Our supply lines are stretched." Hitler didn't listen. He shouted, "If I tell a soldier to take a city, he takes it. There will be no retreat." By late summer, German bombers reduced Stalingrad to rubble. Streets turned into fiery graves. Soviet civilians picked up rifles beside soldiers. Women sniped from rooftops. Children carried ammunition through the sewers. It was no longer just a battle. It was a war of wills. The Wehrmacht, built on precision and speed, now found itself trapped in street-to-street combat. Machine guns barked from ruined factories. Grenades exploded in stairwells. A German officer later wrote, "You could spend an entire day fighting for one floor and lose it the next morning." Meanwhile, in the Soviet high command, General Zhukov planned something devastating. He knew Hitler's pride wouldn't let him retreat. So he prepared Operation Uranus, a massive counterattack to encircle the German Sixth Army inside Stalingrad. When the Soviets struck in November 1942, the Germans were completely unprepared. Temperatures dropped below -30. Fuel froze inside tanks. Soldiers burned furniture for warmth. Still, Hitler insisted, they will fight to the last bullet. Inside Hitler's wolf's lair, generals begged him to allow retreat. But he exploded in rage. "You know nothing of willpower. Paulus will hold the city." General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, listened helplessly to radio messages from his starving men. By January 1943, rations were gone. Wounded soldiers froze to death beside campfires. Entire units surrendered in silence. And yet, in Berlin, propaganda still screamed of victory at Stalingrad. German citizens believed their Führer was invincible. But behind the scenes, reality was crumbling. Factories lacked fuel. Families were burying sons, and whispers spread. The war is lost. Hitler locked himself in meetings for hours, pacing like a trapped animal. He refused to accept surrender. He couldn't imagine it. To him, Stalingrad wasn't just a battlefield, it was his symbol of destiny. And that's why, when Paulus finally radioed his surrender on February 6, 1943, Hitler didn't speak for hours. Witnesses later said he looked as if something inside him had died. From this point forward, Hitler's empire began to rot from within. Generals stopped believing in victory. Soldiers lost faith in the man who once promised them the world. The world's most feared dictator had been broken by a single city. But this was only the beginning, because after Stalingrad, even his own officers started to whisper, "Perhaps the Führer must be stopped." The fall of Stalingrad sent shockwaves across Europe. In Berlin, the Ministry of Propaganda tried to spin it as a heroic sacrifice. Joseph Goebbels went on radio declaring, "The Sixth Army has fulfilled its duty." Their blood has secured the future of the Reich. But the German people weren't fools anymore. Mothers who had stopped receiving letters, workers who saw empty factories, soldiers returning without limbs. They all knew the truth. Germany had bled too much. Inside Hitler's wolf's lair, the atmosphere was thick with fear. The once confident generals now whispered cautiously. No one dared speak the word defeat, not even in private. Hitler had become unpredictable, pale, trembling, and consumed by rage. He started lashing out at his generals. When Field Marshal Manstein tried to explain that the Eastern Front was collapsing and that withdrawal might save the army, Hitler pounded the table and screamed, "Retreat? Never! Not one step backward! The German soldier does not retreat. He conquers or dies." Was madness. He blamed everyone but himself. The weather, his officers, even fate. He convinced himself that Germany's losses were temporary, that new miracle weapons like the Tiger tank and V-2 rockets would turn the tide. But the truth was grim. By the spring of 1943, the Red Army was growing stronger every week. America and Britain were bombing German cities. And in North Africa, Rommel's forces were being crushed. Everywhere Hitler looked, the walls were closing in. Meanwhile, in secret, some German officers began to lose faith in their Führer. Men who had once worshipped him, like Klaus von Stauffenberg, Henning von Treschow, and Ludwig Beck, started whispering among themselves. They had seen the truth. Hitler's obsession with power was leading Germany to total ruin. The turning point came after Stalingrad, when reports reached Berlin that over 300,000 German soldiers were dead or captured. Many never even got proper burials. Their frozen bodies lay across the Volga. One officer quietly told another, "We've lost the war, and he doesn't even know it." They began to plan. If Hitler refused to end the war, maybe they had to end him. But Hitler was no longer the man of 1939. He was paranoid, constantly surrounded by bodyguards, and addicted to amphetamines prescribed by his doctor, Theodor Morell. His hands shook uncontrollably. His speeches became rambling monologues about destiny and betrayal. At meetings, generals would sit in silence as he shouted at maps that no longer matched the real front lines. Still, he believed in his divine mission. He once told his staff, "I will not end up like Napoleon. I will never surrender. Germany will stand or fall with me." In July 1943, as Germany prepared for a desperate counterattack at Kursk, his generals already knew it was doomed. The Soviets had built miles of defenses, minefields, trenches, anti-tank guns, waiting for the German assault. But Hitler insisted on going ahead. He believed the new Panther tanks would secure a decisive victory. Instead, it became one of the largest tank battles in history. And another disaster. Over 2,000 German tanks were lost. The Eastern Front shattered. And when news of the defeat reached Berlin, Hitler reportedly stared blankly at the wall and muttered, "Everything we have built is gone." From that moment, the German high command began to break apart. Some, like Himmler and Göring, clung to Hitler out of fear and ambition. Others, like Stauffenberg, decided there was only one way to save Germany: by removing him forever. Inside the wolf's lair, the first outlines of a plan began to form. A plot that would one day be known as Operation Valkyrie. But for now, Hitler still ruled. Broken, delusional, and surrounded by lies. He believed Stalingrad was just a temporary setback. But deep down, he knew it had destroyed something far greater than his army. It had destroyed his illusion of destiny. By the end of 1943, Germany was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting to survive. And as the Allies advanced and the skies filled with American bombers, Hitler's final empire began to crumble from within. But what came next? Betrayal, explosions, and the near death of the Führer himself would shake the world. By mid-1944, the nightmare that began at Stalingrad had reached its inevitable climax. Germany was now collapsing on all fronts. The Allies had landed in Normandy, the Soviets were advancing from the east, and the once mighty Luftwaffe was practically grounded. But inside Hitler's bunker at the Wolf's Lair, reality had been replaced with delusion. Every morning, Hitler sat before massive wall maps covered with pins and red strings, pretending to command divisions that no longer existed. He barked orders to generals who silently exchanged glances. They knew the truth. Entire units had been wiped out, but no one dared tell him. The Führer was living in a world of ghosts. And that's when Operation Valkyrie, the plan born out of Stalingrad's ashes, finally came alive. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, once a loyal officer, had watched too many of his comrades die for nothing. He had seen the horrors in the East, the slaughter of civilians, and the endless stream of young German soldiers sent to die in hopeless battles. He had lost an eye and a hand in North Africa, and yet he still stood tall, determined to save what was left of Germany by ending the man who had destroyed it. On July 20th, 1944, Stauffenberg carried a briefcase into a conference room inside the Wolf's Lair. Inside that briefcase was a bomb. The meeting began as usual. Hitler, pale and trembling, stood over a large oak map table, ranting about troop movements on the Eastern Front. Around him stood several officers, their faces blank, their eyes tired. Stauffenberg quietly placed his briefcase under the table, near Hitler's leg. He saluted, stepped outside, and began walking toward his car, his heart pounding like a drum. Moments later, an explosion ripped through the bunker. Flames, smoke, screams, chaos erupted. The force of the blast blew out windows, shattered maps, and sent officers flying through the air. Stauffenberg, convinced Hitler was dead, rushed back to Berlin to set the second phase of the coup in motion. For a few brief hours, it seemed like the impossible had happened. The conspirators in Berlin began arresting SS officers, cutting communications, and preparing to seize control of the government. Across Europe, German resistance cells waited for confirmation. The Führer is dead. But Hitler wasn't. The thick oak table had shielded him from the full force of the blast. Though his clothes were torn and his eardrums nearly ruptured, he was alive and furious. With shaking hands, he demanded that cameras be brought in immediately. Within hours, German radio broadcast his voice across the nation. "I am alive, and this time those who betrayed me will be destroyed." What followed was one of the most ruthless purges in Nazi history. Thousands of officers, soldiers, and civilians suspected of disloyalty were arrested, tortured, and executed. The conspirators were hanged by piano wire, their deaths filmed for Hitler's private viewing. Stauffenberg himself was captured and shot the same night, shouting his final words, "Long live Holy Germany!" The dream of saving Germany from within had died, just as the country itself was dying around Hitler. In the following months, his madness deepened. He no longer trusted anyone, not his generals, not even his oldest friends. He blamed everyone for Germany's failures except himself. When the Soviets advanced toward Poland, he screamed that the German people didn't deserve to survive. His once powerful empire was now a wasteland of bombed cities and starving civilians. By early 1945, even Goering and Himmler began secretly contacting the Allies, hoping to save themselves. But Hitler refused to surrender. He retreated to his final bunker beneath the ruined streets of Berlin, declaring that if Germany fell, it would fall with him. And as the city above him burned, with Soviet shells exploding only blocks away, he sat hunched over a map that no longer mattered. The war was lost. The Reich was in ruins. But in Hitler's mind, he was still the chosen one. Betrayed by cowards, but undefeated in spirit. He looked at his generals and whispered, "Stalingrad was never a defeat. It was a test." But everyone knew the truth. It wasn't just an army that had died at Stalingrad. It was Hitler's dream, his delusion, his empire. The destruction that began on the banks of the Volga had now reached Berlin itself. And in the ruins of his bunker, the man who once wanted to rule the world faced the collapse of everything he had built. By the spring of 1945, the echoes of Stalingrad had reached their dreadful conclusion. Berlin, once the proud heart of the Third Reich, was now a shattered skeleton of burning buildings, collapsed streets, and frightened civilians hiding in basements. The war was over, even if Hitler refused to admit it. The Red Army had surrounded the capital, artillery shells pounded the city day and night, and the sound of Soviet tanks echoed through the ruins. Yet inside his underground fortress, the Führer bunker, Adolf Hitler still pretended to command an empire that no longer existed. His generals whispered that Germany was finished, but he continued to issue impossible orders to divisions that had already been wiped out. He screamed at his officers for betraying him, blaming them for his own failures. When reports came that the Soviets were only a few blocks away, he turned pale but refused to flee. He said coldly, "I will not leave Berlin. The capital will become my tomb." The bunker itself was a dark, claustrophobic maze. Concrete walls dripping with moisture, air thick with the stench of fuel, sweat, and despair. Around Hitler sat the remnants of his once mighty command. Goebbels, the master of propaganda, Eva Braun, his devoted mistress, and a handful of aides who no longer believed in victory, only in surviving the next hour. But Hitler's mind had long since fractured. He still ranted about miracle weapons and ghost divisions that would turn the tide. He believed the V-2 rockets or jet fighters could somehow save him, even as Soviet troops marched through the burning streets above. In those final days, he no longer looked like the fiery dictator who once mesmerized crowds. He was an old man, trembling, hunched, with shaking hands that could barely hold a teacup. His eyes, once fierce with madness, now seemed hollow, staring into nothing. On April 28, 1945, news reached him that Mussolini, his Italian ally, had been captured and executed by his own people. His body hung upside down in a public square. Hitler looked at the photographs in silence, his face turning gray. He knew what would happen to him if the Soviets caught him alive. That night, he called his remaining aides into the bunker's dimly lit map room. He told them the war was lost. He blamed the generals, the German people, everyone but himself. Then, in a calm and chilling voice, he said, "Tomorrow, I will put an end to it all." On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet shells thundered above, Hitler and Eva Braun withdrew to his private study. The room was silent except for the distant rumble of war. He handed cyanide capsules to his secretaries and said goodbye. Then, with a pistol in hand, Adolf Hitler took his own life. Moments later, his staff carried his body and Eva's up the narrow stairs to the garden behind the bunker. They poured gasoline over the corpses and set them ablaze as Soviet shells exploded nearby. The flames rose into the air, consuming the final remains of a man who had once sought to rule the world. When the Soviets finally entered the bunker, they found only ashes and fragments of a burned uniform. The man who had plunged the world into darkness was gone. His 1,000-year Reich had lasted only 12 years. But the true end of Hitler's dream hadn't come in Berlin. It had come 2 years earlier, on the frozen banks of the Volga River, in the city of Stalingrad. That was where Germany's illusion of invincibility had shattered, where the myth of the master race was buried under the snow and blood of 300,000 soldiers, where Hitler's arrogance turned from confidence to delusion. Every defeat that followed, in Normandy, in the skies, and finally in Berlin, began the moment he refused to accept Stalingrad as a warning. In the aftermath of the war, the world saw what his madness had cost. Cities reduced to dust, millions dead, entire nations scarred for generations. And yet, from the ruins of Germany, the truth became impossible to deny. Hitler had not just destroyed Europe, he had destroyed himself. As historians later wrote, the road to Berlin began in Stalingrad. It was there that Germany lost not just an army, but its soul. Today, the ruins of Stalingrad, now Volgograd, still stand as silent witnesses. Beneath the quiet streets lie the bones of those who died in one of history's most brutal battles. And every year, when the wind blows across the Volga, it carries with it a whisper, a reminder of the moment when arrogance met reality, and a madman's empire began to crumble.